Something important happened quietly, which is usually how institutional power moves when it's confident. There was no dramatic press conference, no slam doors, no emergency summit splashed across cable news. Canada simply said no and kept moving. On the surface, this looked like another routine disagreement between neighbors, trade friction, diplomatic muscle memory, the kind of cross border tension Washington has seen before and usually resolves with a mix of leverage and patience. But this time, the refusal landed differently. It exposed a structural problem that had been building beneath the rhetoric for years. The deal in question was not just another transactional win, it was the one agreement that mattered most to the strategy being pursued by Donald Trump. The proof point, the validation, the demonstration that pressure still works when applied bluntly, publicly, and personally. Canada was supposed to fold. That assumption wasn't reckless. It was based on decades of precedent. Canada is not an adversarial power. It is deeply integrated into the U.S. economy, tightly bound through supply chains, energy flows, defense coordination, and regulatory harmonization. When Washington pushes, Ottawa usually negotiates. When Washington escalates, Canada absorbs, adjusts, and waits it out. That's the historical rhythm. But this time, the rhythm broke. Canada didn't reject the deal theatrically, it rejected it procedurally, quietly, institutionally. The language was careful, the posture was calm, but the message was unmistakable. The terms no longer made sense under the new assumptions Washington was operating on. That should have been a warning sign because when a middle power with every incentive to compromise chooses not to, it means the cost benefit analysis has shifted somewhere deeper than politics. It means the internal math no longer works, and institutions are ruthless accountants. What makes this moment significant is not the rejection itself, but what it says about credibility. Deals don't fail because of tone or personalities. They fail when enforcement capacity, reputational capital, and future expectations stop aligning. Canada wasn't reacting to a single proposal, it was responding to a pattern. For years, Washington's negotiating strategy under Trump relied on asymmetric pressure, tariffs as leverage, public threats as bargaining tools, and unpredictability as a substitute for long term trust. Against rivals, this approach produced mixed results. Against allies, it created something more corrosive, strategic fatigue. Canada watched the pattern unfold elsewhere. Deals announced as victories were reopened. Agreements framed as final were treated as provisional. Commitments were personalized, then depersonalized depending on political needs. The signal wasn't aggression, it was instability. And institutions do not gamble on instability. From Ottawa's perspective, the question was no longer whether this deal could be signed, but whether it could be relied upon, whether compliance today would still matter tomorrow, whether concessions would buy predictability or invite escalation. This is where Washington misread the moment. It assumed proximity guaranteed compliance. It assumed asymmetry guaranteed leverage. It assumed that Canada's dependence on the U.S. market outweighed Canada's tolerance for uncertainty. That assumption used to be correct. It no longer is. Canada's rejection wasn't defiance, it was recalibration, a recognition that saying yes to the wrong deal carries longer term risks than saying no to a powerful neighbor. When institutions conclude that delay is safer than agreement, leverage has already shifted. What looks like a stalled negotiation is actually a diagnostic moment. It reveals which side believes time is on its side and which side is rushing to lock something in before conditions worsen. Trump needed this deal not just economically but symbolically. It was supposed to reaffirm that allies still bend when pushed hard enough. Canada's refusal suggested the opposite, that allies are learning how to wait, and waiting in institutional politics is rarely passive. It's strategic. This was not a breakdown, it was a signal, one that Washington appeared not to fully register yet. To understand why Canada behaved this way, you have to stop thinking in terms of personalities and start thinking in terms of systems. States don't react to tone. Institutions react to incentives, constraints, and memory. Canada's response was not emotional, not ideological, and not improvisational. It was the predictable output of a bureaucracy that has spent years stress testing its assumptions about the United States. For decades, the US-Canada relationship operated on an unspoken premise. Disagreements were real, but the floor was stable. Trade disputes would arise, but the framework held. Leaders changed, rhetoric fluctuated, yet the institutional backbone, the expectation of continuity, remained intact. That premise is what allowed Canada to absorb shocks without fundamentally revising its strategy. That premise eroded gradually, then suddenly. The first shift was procedural. Agreements stopped behaving like agreements. Negotiations became provisional by default, subject to reopening, reframing, or public renegotiation. From an institutional standpoint, this matters more than any single tariff or clause. When commitments lose durability, the cost of compliance rises, planning becomes harder, investment slows, risk premiums increase. Canada's trade and foreign policy apparatus is deeply conservative in the technical sense. It prioritizes predictability over upside, stability over spectacle. Its civil service is designed to outlast governments and personalities. When that apparatus detects volatility in a partner's behavior, it doesn't retaliate, it insulates. The second shift was reputational. Washington began treating leverage as a substitute for trust rather than a complement to it. Pressure replaced persuasion. This works when the pressured party believes the end state is fixed and the pain is temporary. It fails when the end state itself is unclear. From Ottawa's vantage point, the question wasn't, can we survive this deal? But what precedent does this deal establish? If accepting terms today encourages harder terms tomorrow, the rational move is resistance, not accommodation. Institutions think in sequences, not moments. There is also a structural asymmetry that Washington often overlooks. Yes, Canada depends heavily on access to the US market, but the United States also depends on Canada for supply chain continuity, energy reliability, and regulatory coordination across critical sectors. Dependence cuts both ways, just not always evenly or visibly. Canada's institutions have spent the last several years quietly diversifying options, not decoupling, that would be unrealistic, but de-risking, strengthening ties with Europe, expanding Asia-Pacific trade pathways, reinforcing multilateral dispute mechanisms. None of this replaces the United States, but it reduces the cost of saying no. That context matters because it explains why this rejection wasn't impulsive. It was the product of accumulated learning. Each renegotiation, each tariff threat, each public ultimatum fed into a recalculated baseline. Washington was no longer a reliably static actor. This is where the historical misunderstanding creeps in. American strategists often interpret Allied restraint as weakness. In reality, it's frequently optionality. Canada didn't confront the US because confrontation wasn't necessary. It simply declined to validate a negotiating model that assumed inevitability. There is an intellectual tradition associated with writers like George Will that emphasizes institutions as the true carriers of power, not leaders or moods. This moment fits squarely within that logic. Canada's decision was not about who was in the White House. It was about what kind of system Washington appeared to be operating. Once institutions conclude that a partner treats agreements as tactical rather than structural, cooperation becomes conditional. Deals are no longer anchors, they're experiments, and experiments require caution. So when Canada rejected the deal, it wasn't rejecting America. It was rejecting a set of assumptions about how negotiations now work. Assumptions that once favored speed, deference, and quiet compromise, but no longer do. That shift didn't begin with this deal, merely revealed it. And that brings us to the core miscalculation. Who believed pressure would still produce compliance and why that belief had quietly expired? The miscalculation here wasn't tactical, it was conceptual. Someone in Washington believed that leverage still operated the way it did 10 years ago, and that belief shaped everything that followed. The assumption was simple. Canada needs the deal more than the United States does. Therefore, pressure would accelerate compliance. Deadlines would concentrate attention. Public framing would narrow options. In short, resistance would be costly, and cost would force movement. That logic is not irrational. It's just outdated. What changed is not Canada's dependence, but Canada's tolerance for uncertainty. And that distinction matters more than Washington appears to have realized. Pressure works when the pressured party believes the outcome is fixed and the pain is temporary. But when the outcome itself feels unstable, pressure stops accelerating agreement and starts incentivizing delay. The Trump negotiating style treated time as an enemy. Deals were framed as victories that needed to be secured quickly before markets reacted, before domestic opposition hardened, before political cycles shifted. Speed became a virtue. Hesitation was framed as weakness. Canada's institutions read that differently. They interpreted urgency not as strength, but as asymmetry. If one side needs closure more than the other, the side that can wait quietly gains leverage. This is where the miscalculation hardened. Washington believed unpredictability created advantage. Canada concluded unpredictability increased long-term risk. Those two assessments cannot coexist without friction. Inside the US system, pressure was seen as a multiplier. Inside the Canadian system, it was seen as a signal that enforcement norms were weakening. That's not a moral judgment, it's a bureaucratic one. When rules feel fluid, institutions slow down. They consult more, they escalate internally, they widen the aperture of review. The result is paralysis that looks like resistance. There was also a misread of audience. The deal was framed for domestic consumption in the United States, proof of toughness, evidence of dominance, confirmation that allies still respond to force. But Canada's decision makers weren't optimizing for American headlines. They were optimizing for internal coherence. Accepting a deal under it creates a domestic precedent. It tells future negotiators that escalation works, that threats produce concessions. For a mid-sized power that must negotiate repeatedly with larger actors, that precedent is dangerous. So Canada declined, not because it expected retaliation to be painless, but because it calculated that the long-term cost of acquiescence exceeded the short-term cost of friction. Washington also underestimated institutional memory. Canadian bureaucracies remembered how earlier agreements were reopened, reframed, or publicly disavowed. They watched how certainty eroded elsewhere, and they drew a conclusion that was uncomfortable but clear. Compliance no longer guaranteed closure. That insight reshaped incentives. If compliance doesn't end the negotiation, there is no reward for moving first. In that environment, the rational strategy is patience. Trump's team appears to have believed that Canada would separate rhetoric from reality, that it would absorb public pressure while trusting private assurances. But those assurances were no longer enough. The gap between statement and enforcement had grown too wide. This wasn't about ego or pride, it was about predictability, and predictability is the currency institutions trade in most carefully. The miscalculation then was assuming that pressure still produced inevitability. It doesn't. Not when partners have learned to live with delay, diversify exposure, and wait out volatility. Canada didn't call the bluff, it simply refused to play the hand. And that refusal triggered something more consequential than a stalled deal. It forced institutions on both sides to reveal how they now perceive power and how they intend to use it going forward. What followed Canada's refusal was not retaliation in the dramatic sense. There were no immediate punishments, no sweeping countermeasures announced with flourish. Instead, what emerged was something far more revealing: institutional adjustment, quiet, incremental, and largely invisible to casual observers. This is how mature systems respond when leverage fails. They don't lash out, they reposition. Inside Washington, the rejection forced a recalibration that officials would never frame publicly. Pressure had been applied. The expected compliance hadn't materialized. That meant the strategy, not the partner, required review. But institutions rarely admit misjudgment outright. They adapt around it. Negotiating timelines slowed. Language softened. The urgency that once framed the deal as essential began to dissipate in official communications, not because the deal suddenly mattered less, but because its failure could no longer be allowed to look consequential. Institutions protect credibility by managing expectations. At the same time, bureaucratic energy shifted elsewhere. Attention moved to other files, other partners, other theaters where leverage still appeared to function. This wasn't retreat, it was triage. When a negotiation stops producing returns, systems redeploy resources. Canada noticed. Ottawa's response was equally measured. There was no victory lap, no rhetorical escalation. Instead, Canadian institutions did what they always do when friction persists. They embedded it into planning assumptions. Trade officials adjusted forecasts. Legal teams prepared for extended ambiguity. Diplomatic channels widened, not narrowed. The key point here is that both sides behaved as if this was not a crisis, but also not a misunderstanding. That alone tells you how far the relationship had shifted. In earlier eras, a failed deal of this magnitude would have triggered urgent repair mechanisms. This time, the machinery absorbed the shock and kept moving. That's not indifference, it's normalization. Institutional normalization is one of the clearest indicators that expectations have changed. When friction becomes routine, systems stop expending political capital trying to resolve it quickly. They build around it instead. In Washington, that meant accepting that Canada would no longer reliably respond to public pressure. In Ottawa, it meant accepting that U.S. commitments would remain conditional. Neither side announced these conclusions. They simply acted on them. Markets picked up on the cues faster than politicians did. Volatility didn't spike. Investment didn't flee. The absence of panic signaled that economic actors had already priced in a looser, less predictable bilateral environment. That, too, is institutional learning at work. What's striking is how little drama accompanied these shifts. The absence of noise wasn't a sign of stability, it was a sign of adaptation. Institutions had stopped expecting resolution and started managing endurance. This is where the long-term implications begin to surface. Once bureaucracies internalize that pressure is no longer decisive, they redesign engagement strategies. They rely more on multilateral frameworks. They document more. They commit less. Every interaction becomes slightly more guarded. None of this requires hostility. It only requires caution. The reaction phase then was not about winning or losing the deal. It was about absorbing a new reality. Washington learned that leverage now has limits with allies who can wait. Canada learned that resistance does not necessarily provoke escalation. Both sides adjusted accordingly. And when institutions adjust quietly, they rarely reverse course quickly. That sets the stage for the real consequences. Not immediate, not headline grabbing, but structural. The kind that reshape influence over time rather than announce themselves all at once. The second-order consequences of Canada's refusal didn't arrive as punishment, they arrived as drift. And drift is far more damaging to influence than confrontation. When a deal fails loudly, systems mobilize to fix it. When it fails quietly, systems rewrote. That is what happened here. The immediate outcome looked contained. No trade war, no diplomatic freeze. But beneath that calm, the geometry of power shifted in subtle, durable ways. The first consequence was formational. Canada's refusal recalibrated expectations across other allied capitals, not because Ottawa issued a signal, but because others were already watching. When a close, deeply integrated ally decides that delay is safer than agreement, it tells other partners something uncomfortable. Resistance is survivable. This doesn't produce rebellion. It produces caution, and caution compounds. Allies began approaching Washington with thicker legal buffers, longer review timelines, and fewer assumptions of finality. Agreements became more conditional, commitments more hedged, not because trust vanished, but because predictability did. The second consequence was institutional learning inside the United States itself. Once pressure failed against a cooperative partner, it raised an internal question no one wanted to ask publicly. Where does this strategy still work? That question doesn't get debated on television. It gets debated in memos, in staffing decisions, in which negotiations receive attention and which are quietly deprioritized. Influence doesn't disappear. It gets rationed. As a result, Washington began leaning more heavily on relationships where asymmetry was sharper and resistance costlier. That may feel efficient in the short term, but it narrows the field of cooperation. Power exercised selectively becomes power perceived as situational. Canada, meanwhile, experienced a quieter consequence, validation without celebration. Its institutions learned that refusal did not trigger catastrophe, that learning didn't produce boldness, it produced confidence. The confidence to say not now again in the future if conditions don't align. This is how leverage erodes, not through collapse but through precedent. Each instance of successful resistance lowers the perceived cost of the next one. There is also a market consequence worth noting. Capital is allergic to uncertainty, but it is adaptable. Once investors see that friction is managed rather than explosive, they stop reacting emotionally and start pricing structurally. Supply chains adjust, contracts lengthen or shorten, risk is redistributed. That redistribution doesn't favor volatility-driven leverage, it favors predictability-driven partners. What's notable is that none of the winners in this phase are celebrating. Canada didn't win in any triumphant sense. It absorbed cost, it accepted delay, it tolerated ambiguity. Washington didn't lose outright, but it paid an opportunity cost. Time spent pressing Canada was time not spent building alternative frameworks. This is the paradox of second-order consequences. The actors who gain flexibility rarely feel victorious, and the actors who lose leverage rarely feel defeated. Everyone adapts. The scoreboard doesn't light up, but the game changes. The deeper effect is psychological and it cuts across institutions. Once allies believe that the United States values speed over durability, they stop offering speed. Once they believe that pressure substitutes for trust, they stop extending trust cheaply. None of this requires anti-American sentiment. It requires arithmetic. Power that relies on urgency weakens when others learn to wait. Canada's refusal became part of that arithmetic. Not a turning point by itself, but a data point, one that reinforced a growing pattern. The system absorbed it, learned from it, and moved on. And when systems move on, they rarely circle back unchanged. Which brings us to the final question, not about this deal or even this administration, but about what this moment reveals about how power now operates and what durability actually looks like in an era of constant pressure. Step back from the deal and the personalities fade quickly. What remains is a lesson about how modern power behaves when institutions, not leaders, are doing the real work. Canada's rejection was not a rupture, it was a stress test, and the results were quietly conclusive. It showed that credibility now matters more than leverage, that predictability outperforms pressure, and that institutions adapt faster than political narratives acknowledge. For much of the post-war era, American power benefited from an assumption of permanence. Allies disagreed with Washington, sometimes sharply, but they rarely doubted that commitments would hold long enough to justify compromise. That assumption functioned as invisible capital. It reduced transaction costs. It accelerated deals. It made pressure effective because it was embedded in a stable system. What this moment revealed is not that American power has disappeared, but that the capital has thinned. When institutions begin to treat U.S. commitments as provisional, leverage becomes noisier and less efficient. Pressure still exists, but it produces hesitation rather than compliance. Canada didn't expose this reality alone. It simply demonstrated it clearly. There is a temptation to read this episode as a referendum on one negotiating style or one administration. That interpretation is comforting but incomplete. The deeper issue is institutional memory. Once allies internalize a pattern of volatility, that memory outlasts any single leader. Systems are slow to trust and even slower to forget. This is where resilience enters the picture. Canada's institutions behaved the way resilient systems do. They absorbed shock without escalation, adjusted expectations without confrontation, and preserved optionality without burning bridges. That is not defiance, it is strategic adulthood. The United States, by contrast, revealed a different vulnerability, not weakness, but impatience, a preference for immediacy over accumulation, for visible wins over quiet durability. That preference doesn't destroy power, but it changes how power is received. In a world where allies can wait, diversify, and manage ambiguity, urgency becomes a liability. Credibility becomes the scarce resource, and institutions notice scarcity faster than politics does. The irony is that nothing about this outcome was inevitable. Pressure works best when it is backed by confidence that the end state will endure. Once that confidence erodes, pressure accelerates learning, not compliance. Canada learned it could say no. Others observed. Washington adjusted. No one panicked. Everyone adapted. That adaptation is the story. This moment tells us that modern power is less about forcing agreement and more about sustaining belief. That terms will hold, that concessions will not be reopened, that compliance will actually conclude a negotiation. When belief fades, institutions stop rushing. They stop conceding early. They start waiting. Canada waited. Washington discovered it could be waited out. That is not collapse. It is recalibration.